Aristotle, I suggested, was as great a mind as they come. He invented all sorts of disciplines of human inquiry, including logic, much of what we call biology. He also gave a name to disciplines of inquiry which had already existed, but which never got systematized until Aristotle got a hold of them. He gave us the name metaphysics for what Plato was doing with forms. He also gave us the notion of ethics as inquiry into the good. If metaphysics is inquiry into true being, then ethics is inquiry into the true good. Right? So metaphysics is to being as ethics is to good. So Aristotle's ethics is an inquiry into what's the good. What is the good for human beings? And Aristotle emphasizes that point. Just as he wants to take these Platonic forms and bring them to earth, as in the famous picture with Raphael, and Plato's pointing up and Aristotle's pointing out. Well, likewise, Aristotle wants to bring the good down to earth. He wants to talk about what is the good for human beings. He's not interested in that vision of the good outside of the cave up there in this kind of heavenly, otherworldly vision. He wants to know what is the good for human beings. What is the good that human action can obtain? Now, when he talks about the good, he once again, as so often in Greek thought, is using a familiar word in a rather different way than we're familiar with. For Aristotle, every good has the character of an end, in Aristotle's sense of final cause, a purpose. Whenever you're trying to do something, you're trying to achieve some good. If you're building a house, the good toward which you're aiming is a house, right? If you're looking for food, the good for which you're looking is food, right? And you're always looking for something good, right? You're looking for food, you want good food, not bad food. You're building a house, you want to build a good house, not a bad house. So the end of every process has the character of a good. Or at least it's what we want out of that process is a good version of the end of that process. We want a good house, we want good food. So the good for Aristotle has the character of an end, that for the sake of which we do something. So the question, what is the good for human beings, boils down to the question, what is the end, that is the goal or purpose of human life? What is our good? What is our end? What are we aiming for as humans? Right? What is it that, simply because we're human, we aim for? Now, in one sense then, this question's fairly easy to answer. What is it that human beings aim for? Aristotle in one of his early works says, well, look, don't we all want to be happy? Isn't it obvious? Isn't it necessary? Everyone wants to be happy. Right? Happiness is an end that we aim for. Right? It's the goal of a lot of the processes we engage in. Right? And not only is it the end, it is the final end, the last end. Once you're happy, you're not looking for anything else. Right? You look for food or a house or any of these other things in order to be happy with it. So happiness is a word that designates the end that you get to, and you want this for its own sake. It's not a means, it's an end. That's language that Aristotle will use, right? Happiness is never a means to some other end, right? It's an end in itself, which is what he means by a final end, right? Once you're there, you've got what you want, and you don't want this for the sake of something else, you want it for its own sake. That's happiness. Okay. However, once again, the word happiness does not mean for Aristotle quite the same thing that it means for us. Our word happiness translates a Greek word eudaimonia, which does not necessarily designate a feeling. Right? The way happiness for most of us in the 20th century or 21st century, as it soon will be, happiness designates for most of us a feeling. Right? When we say I'm happy, we mean I feel happy. For Aristotle and for all of Greek language, the word for happiness designated something more like success. Right? So think of success when Aristotle talks about happiness. Right? What makes a life a real success? Right? That's, again, another way of saying this is what we want when we want something for its own sake, not as a means to some other end. Right? What's the success we're looking for? Or, another possible translation, human flourishing. Right? What is a human life that is truly successful? What is a human life that really is a flourishing human life? That's what happiness is. Right? Now, happiness may be a feeling. Right? It may be that a successful human life is a life that feels good. Right? That was the answer to this question given by philosophers known as hedonists. Hedonist is a technical term. It does not mean people who live a wild life. It means philosophers who think that happiness consists of pleasure, that happiness is a feeling. Right? Because if happiness is a feeling, then happiness is a pleasant feeling. The Greek word for pleasure is hedone, from which we get our word hedonist. So a hedonist is a philosopher who thinks that the goal of human life is to feel good. Right? Now, that's not an obvious answer to the question of what the goal of human life is. It's not even an obvious answer to the question, what is happiness? At least not if happiness means what Aristotle means by it, right? Or what all of the Greeks meant by it. Happiness is success in human life, right? Maybe, if the hedonists are right, success in human life means feeling good. But maybe it means something else, too. And that's the big issue. So what we've done really is we've marched through three questions. We've asked, what's the good for human beings, right? Which is then translated into, well, what's the end or purpose of human life? And then that becomes a question, well, what is happiness? Right? These are all questions which all of the philosophers after Aristotle agreed are the key questions for ethics. Everyone agreed that these are the big issues. What's the good? What's the end? What is happiness? We know that happiness is the end of human life. Everyone agrees about that. But what is happiness? And that's where the disagreements start. The hedonist says happiness is feeling good. Happiness is pleasure. And what pleasure is feeling good. But there are other possible answers. And Aristotle, as well as Plato and many others, are interested in giving a non-hedonistic answer to the question, what is the good for human life? What is happiness? So, if we have a good or an end for human life that is other than just feeling good, then that means that simply because of our human nature, right, nature, that key Aristotelian word, simply because of our human form, our human essence, simply because we are human, we have a built-in goal. There is an end of human nature, a goal that we have simply because we're human. It's not the same thing as any goal that we might choose, right? We can choose all sorts of goals which might make us unhappy, after all, right? Imagine someone who's addicted, right, who craves stuff that makes them miserable, right? So to say that we have an end or goal is not the same thing as to say we choose that end or goal. Aristotle's interested in what is the intrinsic, objective goal of human nature, as it were. Not a goal that we happen to choose, right? We might happen to choose what will make us really happy. That would be great. But sometimes we choose things that make us unhappy, right? So what makes us happy is not something we choose, right? It's something that's intrinsic to human nature. Human nature is a teleological thing. It has its own built-in goal, right? Like the process of physical growth, right? A human child has this built-in goal of becoming an adult, right? The child may choose that goal or may choose against that goal. The child may try to do things that stunt its growth, but the goal of becoming an adult is built into the child's physical nature. So Aristotle's asking, what kind of goal is built into our nature as rational animals, right? The goal of growing up is built into our nature as animals, right? It's a goal we share with dogs and cats and horses. And that is a real goal of human nature. But it's not a distinctive goal of human nature, right? The distinctive goal or end of human nature has to be the goal that's associated with our being rational animals, our fulfillment as rational creatures. So what's that goal? The goal that would fulfill us as rational creatures. That's the track that Aristotle's following in his question about ethics. So before we get to the answer to that question, let's think a little bit more about the notion of an end, or a built-in goal, right? What kind of things do we have as an example of built-in goals? Well, I've suggested something about the natural process of growth, right, the built-in goal of adulthood. Let's turn once again, as we did before, to art, to an artificial process, or an artful process. Think now about an art like flute playing, right? That has a built-in goal, right? A flute player, as flute player, has a goal, right? Because that person is a flute player. Insofar as she is a flute player, her goal is what? To play the flute well, right? To live the life of a flute player who's good at it, right? Who's good at this art, who plays the flute well. Well, Aristotle thinks there's something like that in human nature as such, right? Simply because we're human, there's certain things we need to be good at in order to be happy, right? We have to be good at being human, right? And there is such a thing as being good at being human, just as there's such a thing as being good at playing the flute. The name for being good at being human is virtue, right? It's a Greek word, arete, which can also be translated excellence. Virtue is the same thing as human excellence. Virtue means being excellent at being human, just as skill in playing the flute means being excellent at flute playing. So you see what Aristotle's done now is he's hooked up the notion of the good to the notion of an end in his physics, and then to the notion of happiness, and now to the notion of virtue, which is a common Greek term, right? The word virtue is not a word we use much anymore, except when we talk about dieting. But in ancient Greece, it was a very common word, right? The question that the sophists and Socrates and Plato were all arguing about is, what is virtue? Right? What is it to be an excellent human being? Right? They worried about this. What is a really good human being like? What is an excellent human being like? What does human excellence consist in? So we're now going to move on to the question, well, what does human excellence consist in? But at this point, Aristotle can give us at least a definition of happiness, which is going to be the key definition in ethics. Happiness for Aristotle means the activity of the rational soul in accordance with virtue. Right? Happiness means doing what an excellent human being does. That's what happiness consists in. So now we need to find out what human excellence consists in order to find out what happiness is. Right? So now we have to inquire what is virtue. Right? First, we're going to look at virtue in general, the concept of virtue in general, and then we'll look at specific virtues. But let me just remind you real quick in advance of a few examples of virtue: justice, courage, temperance, also intelligence. These are virtues, right? They make you excellent at being human, as skill in playing the flute makes you excellent as a flute player. But now we need to talk about the notion of virtue in general, because it's key to understand what that is. Everyone in ancient Athens talks about virtue. Everyone's concerned about it. So this is a going concern, and Aristotle comes in as the philosopher saying, look, we already have a whole bunch of ideas about virtue. Right? We talk about it all the time. We make speeches about it. So let me, as the philosopher, kind of organize this talk and try to give a theory about what virtue is that sort of draws upon all the things that we Athenians are talking about and tries to make sense of them all. And that's how Aristotle works as a philosopher. He starts with things that ordinary people say, and he tries to get it all organized and make it all make sense. So, let's start with virtue. What is a virtue? Well, for Aristotle, a virtue is a good state of the soul, sort of analogous to health, which is a good state of the body, right? And you have to have some kind of name for what's happening when a body is doing its work well, right? And that's health. Well, likewise, virtue is our name for what's happening when a soul is doing its work well. Right? In particular, when a rational soul is doing its work well. That's a virtue. So, what kind of state is it? Aristotle classifies it as a habit, a habitual state. Right? That means a learned capacity to do certain sorts of things well. Right? Flute playing and all other skills are habits. Right? In this broad sense. Again, this is an Aristotelian word which has a broader meaning than we're used to. Flute playing skill is a habit in the sense that it's not something we're always doing. Right? The flute player has this habitual skill all the time, but isn't always playing the flute. So there's this big distinction for Aristotle between a habit, which you have 24 hours a day, and the exercise or use of the habit. Right? The flute player is always a flute player. The flute player is always a flute player, even when she's not playing the flute. Right? She has that habit or skill, even when she's sleeping. Right? But when she's playing the flute, then she's exercising that habit. Right? She is involved in the activity, not just the habit, of flute playing. And remember, Aristotle had defined happiness as the activity of a rational soul in accordance with this habit called virtue. So, it's a habit, and here comes another key point. Like other habits, it's acquired by practice. Like skills, it is learned by habituation and practice, just like flute playing, right? And now this has an interesting structure, this ability to acquire a habit or acquire a virtue or acquire a skill. Think about how it works again with flute playing. You start out, you want to be a flute player, but you're not a flute player yet. Right? This is what Aristotle will call a motion, right? A movement from potential to actual. How does this motion or process of growth work? Well, you start out not knowing how to do it, but you do it anyways. Right? Here you are with a flute in your hands. You don't know how to play the flute, but you start playing. Right? You do it badly, but as you do more and more and more of it, you get better. Eventually, you have the skill of playing the flute. And now when you play the flute, you play it well. Not only do you play it well, you play it easily. Right? You like playing it. You enjoy it much more than the first time you tried it. Right? So acquiring a virtue is like acquiring a skill. You do it by practice. Right? How do you acquire the virtue of courage? Well, you do courageous things even if you don't feel like it, even if you're not good at it. You just do it. Right? Like a soldier who's facing battle for the first time. Right? He practices the acts of courage. As he practices more, he gets better at it. And they come easier. Right? Just like flute playing comes easier when you have the skill. Right? They come easier, and you take pleasure in them. Right? A courageous person takes pleasure in acts of courage. A just person takes pleasure in acts of justice. Right? Because virtue, Aristotle says, and this is another key point, virtue is about how we relate to pleasures and pains. Right? We take pleasure in the right things if we are virtuous people. Right? We take pleasure in the wrong things if we're vicious people. Right? Just as a skillful flute player takes pleasure in playing the flute. But that's not where we start. We have to acquire that skill, that habit, or that virtue. And you start just by practicing and doing it badly. But as you get better at it, the activity that goes along with this virtue or skill or habit gets easier and becomes second nature, we might say. Now, the habit has to be distinguished from natural capacities. Right? The habit or the skill is a capacity to do something, a learned or acquired capacity to do something. And that's different from a natural capacity. Right? The ability to reason is natural. Right? Simply by growing up, we will learn something about reasoning. Walking is a natural ability. But flute playing is not natural. Right? It's not sort of inborn. You have to acquire it. So in that sense, it's artificial. Right? It's an art. But in another sense, these things are natural to us because they're part of the natural abilities. They're things we can use our natural abilities for. Right? We're not born as flute players, but we can use our natural deftness and dexterity to learn to become flute players. And likewise, virtue, in a certain sense, is natural to us because it's the perfection and excellence that's most appropriate to a human being. It becomes second nature to us. And in another sense, it is natural in the sense that it's the good state that belongs to our soul, that befits our soul as health befits a healthy body. Right? Now, let's talk a little bit about how virtue goes from habit to action. Right? Virtue is a habit of doing the right thing in the right situation. Right? Doing the courageous thing in situations that call for courage, or doing the temperate, moderate thing in situations that call for temperance. That means that virtue has to do with decisions. Right? Virtue requires you to make the tough decision in the right place. And that means that virtue always has an emotional component, but also an intellectual component. Virtue means you have to know how to make the right decisions. You have to have a certain kind of smarts about it. Intelligent judgment, recognizing your situation, knowing when to do the brave thing and when to retreat and save your life. That's part of virtue. So a certain kind of know-how is part of virtue. And we're going to get back to that in a minute, because that's a key feature of Aristotle's ethics. Let me now jump to the virtues in the plural. I've been talking about virtue in general. Now I want to talk about virtues in the plural. This is how Aristotle proceeds. He wants to say that virtue in general is a mean between two extremes. And we can illustrate this with the first of the virtues that he talks about, courage. Courage is a mean between the extreme of rashness on the one hand and cowardice on the other hand. Right? What happens in all the virtues is you have intelligent judgment about how to find the mean between two extremes. How to do the right thing, which is not go off crazy on one hand or cowardly on the other hand. So a courageous soldier doesn't run away from battle, but he also doesn't run toward battle and just get himself killed for no reason. Right? He's not rash, and he's not cowardly. He's in the middle. Right? And in every particular situation, it takes intelligence and judgment to find the right place in the middle. Right? You need to know when you should charge a machine gun emplacement and when not to. The courageous man is not the person who always charges in the face of a machine gun fire. He's the person who knows when to do it and when to do it in ways that will be successful. So courage is the mean between these two extremes, rashness on the one hand and cowardice on the other hand. Courage is often paired with a virtue called temperance, because courage has to do with how we deal with pain and other things that are fearful. Temperance has to do with how we deal with pleasure and other things that are desirable. It has to do especially with bodily pleasures. Right? The temperate person is someone who eats and drinks and deals with sex in the moderate, right sort of way. Right? Is neither self-indulgent with those bodily pleasures, but also not insensitive. Right? Not someone who has no feeling for good food, drink, and even sex. Right? Because an adult person deals with all these bodily pleasures in the right, moderate, temperate sort of way. So here are two virtues that are sort of mirror opposites of one another. Courage is about how to deal with pain and things that are fearful. Temperance is about how to deal with pleasure and things that are attractive. And those are the two key individual virtues, we could say. There's two others that I want to mention. And all four of them together are the four cardinal virtues, as they were later called. Aristotle doesn't call them cardinal virtues. But that title comes later. These four virtues are, in fact, key to all of Greek thought. Plato identified these same four virtues. And so they become... They play a role in Aristotle's ethics rather like the four causes do in his physics. Right? They organize his thought. So there's courage and temperance. Then there's the virtue of justice, right, which is the key political virtue, of course, the key virtue of social life. For Aristotle, justice centers around what we now call distributive justice. That was actually his term. It means giving people what they deserve. Giving people what you owe them. To each his own, or to each his due, is the usual Greek definition of justice, and Aristotle basically approves of that. Justice means that everybody gets what they deserve in one way or another. Right? And a just person is a person who has the habit of knowing what to give to people. Respect to people who deserve respect, money to people who you owe money to, et cetera, et cetera. All the sort of relationships where there's give and take. Justice is about giving the right thing, taking the right thing. Not giving too much, right? Not giving things away that you shouldn't give away. Not giving things to the wrong people at the wrong time. Not taking things that are not yours, right? Theft is a form of injustice, right? That's not yours. To each his own means that belongs to someone else, not to you. So justice means that all those social relationships of give and take are working out right. And that you yourself know in any particular situation what to do about the give and take of social life. So that's three virtues: courage, temperance, and justice. And now I want to get back to the intellectual side of this. The fourth virtue of the four cardinal virtues is, I'll translate it, practical wisdom. It means the kind of smarts that you have to have in order to know when to charge the machine gun emplacement and when to retreat. Right? A courageous person will sometimes retreat, right? Because if the enemy has superior force, and attacking them simply means you're going to die, then it's not courage to attack the enemy then. It's foolishness. It's rashness. Right? It's both rashness and foolishness at the same time. Right? It's a vice of rashness, and it's a form of stupidity. Right? So in all of the virtues, practical wisdom plays a part. You can't have any of the virtues without practical wisdom. You can't be courageous unless you know the difference between rashness and cowardice in any particular situation. The example I love to give of this is Tom Hanks in the movie Saving Private Ryan. He's the captain that his men love him, right? Because not only does he have courage, but he has smarts. He knows when to attack and when to retreat. He's not going to send his men into danger for no reason. He will send them into danger, and they will go because they admire his virtues of courage and practical wisdom. Right? He's a smart guy, and that's not an accident. That's essential to the kind of courage he has. Right? Any captain you're going to follow into battle, you want that captain to have not only courage, but that kind of practical intelligence. In fact, he can't have the courage without practical intelligence. If all he's got is guts, then all he's got is rashness and foolishness. He's going to lead you into death. You don't want that. You want this guy to have courage and practical wisdom, and he can't have the one without the other. Right? Practical wisdom is the smarts to make the right decision in the right situation. So all of the virtues are all about making these practical decisions in particular situations, and all require that kind of smarts. Right? For Aristotle, you see, virtue is not a matter of following rules. Right? There are rules of thumb that you follow, but it's not about following the right law in the right situation, right? Because in any particular situation, there's more than one law that applies, right? Be courageous, fight the enemy bravely, but don't be stupid, retreat when you have to, right? Those laws both apply in all sorts of situations. You have to know which to do when, right? You have to judge what to do in particular situations, and all situations are particular. So practical wisdom is the knack, the skill, the intelligence, the judgment to make the right decision in the right time and the right place, and to behave virtuously. You can't have any virtues without that. You can think of it also like a basketball player. Here's Michael Jordan. He's got to decide, going to shoot, going to pass, right? Michael Jordan knows which to do because he's got the practical basketball smarts, the practical wisdom of the basketball court. But that's totally inseparable from the fact that he's also got all these other skills, right? You can't have the smarts without the skills. You can't have the skills without the smarts. So intelligence, then, is a crucial part of the moral life, right? You can't be a virtuous person if you're stupid, right? And stupid here does not mean unintelligent, bad at IQ test or something. It means foolish. Right? This is an old ancient word. All ancient ethics, both in the Bible and in the Greeks, have this word foolishness or stupidity. Right? A stupid person is not a virtuous person. I used to work with retarded adults, and we had a saying: these people are retarded, but they're not stupid. Right? They have low IQ, but they're not stupid, because stupid is a morally loaded term. Right? If you're following this captain into battle, you don't want him to be stupid. Right? He's not a good captain if he's stupid. Right? He's got to have good judgment. He's got to know what to do. Right? Likewise, a basketball player. A basketball player doesn't know when to shoot and when to pass is stupid about basketball. He's not a good basketball player. Right? So a human being who doesn't know what decision to make in a crucial situation is not good at being human. Right? The practical smarts of knowing what to do in a particular situation is part of virtue, because it's part of being good at being human. Okay, I need to rush on to a couple of last points about Aristotle's ethics. Aristotle's ethics is concerned with social life in two crucial ways. The biggest section of Aristotle's book on ethics, the largest discussion, is given to the topic of friendship. Isn't that interesting that a book on ethics spends more time on friendship than on any other topic? And that's because a virtuous person needs friends, Aristotle thinks. Because who would choose to live without friends? How could you have a happy life without friends? As Aristotle says at one point, how does he put it? Who would want to have the whole world and be alone? Right? The virtuous person, the happy person, the person who's good at being human, will seek out friends for quite a number of reasons. Friends do good for each other. Right? Friendship should be based on virtue. You want a good person as your friend, not a bad person. And true friendship is a friendship among good people who are not just using each other for their own private interests, but want to do good to each other. Right? You seek out a friend so you can do good to this friend, and so the friend can do good for you. The friend also helps you understand who you are. Right? The friend helps you in the task of practical wisdom and virtue. The friend is, as Aristotle says very famously, a second self, or another I. The Latin translation is alter ego, another I. So in the friend I have a self who mirrors myself, in whom I can come to understand myself, someone who wants to be good to me so that I can be good to this person. Evil people don't make good friends, because if you're friends with an evil person, then you may have to do bad things in order to cover up their evil acts. Right? Good people don't put you in that position when they're your friends. That's why true friendship is based on virtue. Right? You're never going to have to do something bad in order to cover up the acts of a good person who's your friend. So true friendship is among good people. So friendship is closely related to virtue that way. And finally, at the end of the Ethics, Aristotle talks about politics. Because politics, it turns out, is the overarching science or discipline that deals with the human good. Ethics is primarily concerned with what happens in individual souls. Politics is concerned with how you get a whole bunch of human beings together and get them to live together. So politics has to be the overarching discipline. Right? Politics is about how you get a bunch of human beings together and to live well as a community. And the crucial thing there is that they have to be virtuous. Right? They have to be good to each other, not bad to each other. And virtuous people are good to each other. So the crucial task of politics, it turns out, is to make laws that will help people become virtuous. Right? For Aristotle, politics is all about legislating morality. Not in the sense of telling people what to do all the time, because that's not how morality works for Aristotle. Right? Ethics does not work by following rules. Rather, in politics, you legislate in such a way as to form people as virtuous people. Right? The point of laws is not to tell people what to do in every situation, but to help them become the right sort of person. Virtuous people. People who are good at being human. That's what politics is for. And that's what human life is for, is to be good at being human in community, in a community where friendship between good people is possible.